Welcome to the Hive podcast, a new 10-part series with me, Nathalie Nahai, exploring technology's impact on our personal, cultural and political lives. You can subscribe to the show on iTunes, SoundCloud and YouTube and join in the conversation with the hashtag HivePodcast. If you enjoy the show, please do give us a rating on iTunes as it helps spread the word and makes it easier for other people to also find this content. And now for the show. Dr David Stillwell is the Deputy Director of the Psychometric Centre at the University of Cambridge, and he's also a lecturer in big data analytics and quantitative social science. While researching his PhD in cognitive decision-making, David created a Facebook app called My Personality and a user-facing app called Apply Magic Source, both of which accurately predict the psychological traits of users from their digital footprints of online behaviour. Over 6 million people have taken the My Personality questionnaire, and quite unsurprisingly, his research has attracted a lot of attention in the press for its predictive accuracy and potential implications. In this episode, we'll be exploring the fascinating and sometimes frightening world of psychometric profiling and data mining, how it's done, what it can reveal, and where responsibility for ethical practice might lie. David, thank you very much for joining me today. It's a real pleasure to have you in conversation.
Hello, Nathalie.
So before we dive in, can you tell us a little bit about psychometric research, what it is and how it works?
Okay, so basically as psychometricians, we're trying to measure stuff that's going on in people's heads. So if you wanted to measure how tall someone is, then you could use a ruler. But if you want to measure how extroverted someone is or how good their numerical ability is, then you can't use, physical means to find out the answer to those questions. So what we do is we come up with questionnaires, we come up with tests, and we use those to try and find out what are the individual differences between people. Which people are great at maths, which people aren't great at maths. So this kind of stuff is used in business. It's used in selecting people for jobs based on, personality, based on job-related skills. It's used in education as well. So if you want to measure how good someone is, then you use an exam, and a psychometrician might check how good that exam is. It's even used in medicine. So if you want to measure how depressed someone is or someone's physical functioning, then you might use a questionnaire to say, how difficult do you find it to get out of bed in the morning? Can you run a marathon? And again, we're trying to measure these things that sort of people perceive in their heads rather than sort of physical things.
Fascinating. And when you're using these sorts of questionnaires and tools online, what are some of the ways in which they can be deployed?
Yeah, so I created this My Personality app, as you mentioned. So people can, take a questionnaire, write about themselves, and then they get feedback on the results. So it all gets analyzed automatically. There's a mathematical formula behind it that then says, well, given this set of answers on the questionnaire, then here is where you sit on this scale from, low extroversion to high extroversion compared to other people who've taken the same scale. So my research specifically has started looking at, can we replace these questionnaires with the other data that people have already sort of made available, or at least, have ended up being collected through going about their everyday lives. So instead of asking people, I like going to parties, strongly agree, strongly disagree, we can actually use their Facebook data, for example, to see how many parties do they actually go to. And then instead of, them talking about their opinion of whether they like going to parties or not, it's sort of based on more objective data. How many parties do they actually go to?
So you're basically getting a truer read for people's actual behaviour as opposed to self-reported indications of what their behaviour might be like or idealised versions of what we'd like to think we like.
Yeah, exactly. So, the digital data isn't perfect. So the way that someone acts on Twitter or on social media is to some extent idealized as well. But certainly with a questionnaire, at least if you're trying to look great when applying for a job, you only have to present yourself as great, for a couple of hours it takes to do a questionnaire. Whereas if you're trying to do that with your Twitter data, then you might have to write all these brilliant tweets over years and years. And it's much more difficult to sort of fake for such a long time.
And do you think that people are aware at the level at which these sorts of research practices can be deployed? So, for instance, just to give people a bit of background, back in 2012, alongside Mikhail Kaczynski and Thor Grapel at the Psychometrics Centre at Cambridge, you co-authored what's now considered one of the most seminal pieces of research exploring how private traits and attributes, some of the things that you mentioned, like extroversion, etc., can be predicted from our digital records. In this case, using Facebook likes of over, I think it was 58,000 volunteers, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So it was one of the first studies of its kind that actually showed that this was possible, to use this kind of data automatically to accurately predict a range of really sensitive personal information. So things like our sexual orientation, ethnicity, religious and political views, intelligence, happiness, use of addictive substances, etc. This sort of example that we're giving here, these were volunteers, so there was obviously informed consent, it being an academic study. But do you think people are aware of the amount of information that they give away, even nowadays when people are a little bit more aware of the fact that their data isn't private? Do they know how far people can go?
Yeah, so that was why I think our study got so much interest, among academics, but also among the general population, because we were sort of contrasting these things that you're clicking the like button on. So my favorite celebrities, my favorite musicians, my favorite films, stuff that people did kind of without really thinking too much about it, with these really personal things where previously, to measure someone's personality involved quite a sort of formal questionnaire and quite a, quite a formal setup to actually do it. So just this contrast between stuff that people do without thinking and these really personal things was what surprised people. Now, are people more aware now? I'd like to think they're a little bit more aware, but on the other hand, I think people are not necessarily that concerned by what is possible. They're more concerned with what's actually being done. Knowing that, Facebook or Google or whatever could do something is different to knowing, what are they actually doing with our data? And I think that's what's a bit missing at the moment. It's that sort of, just because it's possible, it doesn't mean that it's being done. And people want to know, well, what are you actually doing with the data?
And do you think that people are starting to have an understanding of the possible implications? So, for instance, I know that in China, there's a really interesting, quite frightening system of rating citizens based on various traits, including for trustworthiness, it's in the process of being developed and deployed. Do you think that's something that people believe is possible with this kind of data? Or do you think it just doesn't even strike us because it's not happening yet? Or if any of this kind of information is being compiled on people, so our propensity to, take more risks or have a propensity towards drug use or whatever, that we just think it won't be used against us by insurance companies or governments or whatever it might be?
Yeah, so China's definitely going the furthest, I think, in terms of really putting some of these possible algorithms into practice. So, yeah, I saw someone tweeted that they were on a train going into Beijing, and the automated announcement on the train said, don't break the train rules, because if you do, they'll be put onto your credit score. So suddenly, not throwing away rubbish on the train might mean I'm not given a loan. Or the other one I heard about was police people in a train station wearing not Google Glass, but something a bit like Google Glass, so glasses with a camera on. And this camera was looking at the faces of all the people walking past, and it could then recognize if there was a face of someone who, it was wanted by the police, and then they could go over to this person and arrest them. And apparently they did catch multiple people who'd been on the run for some time, just passing by in a train station because they had this automated facial recognition. And I think in the West, we're kind of used to that certain classes of decisions are protected and have lots of rules around them. So it's not so easy to use this stuff in credit scoring, for example. So we do have some kind of protection, but on the other hand, just the potential uses of it are so wide. So the facial recognition at train stations, that there aren't sort of special laws for everything, and people haven't necessarily thought about what's possible. And I'm not sure that they really will until it starts happening, and then they'll start reacting to what's being done.
It seems to me that in the West, not just the West, but I think when you look at cultural patterns of populations, we tend to be more short-term oriented. And I think this idea of only contemplating the potential ramifications of something when it's starting to impact us in the here and now, as opposed to thinking, well, how might this be used in 10, 15 years' time? We're not kind of in a cultural context in which we tend to think about stuff in the long term.
With China as well, the population is so huge that companies and people in general know that you can't offer some kind of personalized service based on a person making a decision. So you just expect that, all data in China is big data. So everything has to be done on a large scale, which means you're going to get these decisions that were previously made by humans starting to be made by algorithms. And that's something that, both they accept and they sort of want to happen, because if an algorithm isn't doing it, then it will be too expensive for a person to do it on such a large scale.
Well, so let's talk about big data for a little bit. So specifically the use of psychographic targeting with regards to let's say about political ads, because that's obviously been at the forefront of many discussions in the last while. So the profiling methods that were used, for instance, in the US and in the UK regarding Trump and then the Brexit campaign, were based upon some of the work of Mikhail Kaczynski, who's a co-author from the study I mentioned earlier, and a recent massive peer-reviewed study that was published in October 2017, which I will link in the show notes, indicates that this kind of technique of profiling people can be incredibly effective and actually don't require that much knowledge to execute and do well. So when it comes to the ways in which tech shapes our behaviours, and in which these sorts of academically sourced and developed techniques can be used by non-trained, non-academic, non-ethically approved entities, where do you think lies a responsibility for ethical use?
Yeah, so it's very tricky. So when we published our paper showing that Facebook likes can predict these really personal things, I remember we sat around, and as researchers, we're encouraged to link our research to the real world. So, we sat around and we thought, well, how could this actually be used in practice? And someone said, well, what about personalized marketing? So you could change the content of an advert, or you can change the targeting of an advert based on the psychology of the person you're talking to. And, we sort of thought, yeah, okay, that's good enough. Shove that in at the end. And, we'll sort of say that this kind of thing is possible. But we never thought that anyone would use it, at the very least for another, 10, 15 years, because most academic stuff is a long time before anyone, pays attention to it. But yeah, we published our paper, and then very soon after, there was interest in doing this stuff in marketing. So we started our own experiment, almost immediately after publication, working with a marketing company to show or to try and measure whether it is possible to personalize adverts and change the targeting based on the psychology of the person that you're talking to. So whether that's actually possible in practice. And then, as you say, so at the end of last year, we finally sort of finished and published our results showing that, yes, indeed, it is possible, and yes, indeed, it is more effective. I do need to sort of temper it a little bit. So the company who worked with Trump has sort of announced to everyone that, they're the reason that Trump got elected. but there's not really any evidence that what they were doing was so incredible. And certainly what we found out in our own study was it's not trivial to actually do this in practice. So we were doing marketing of cosmetics. So then you have to, when it comes down to the real world of actually doing this personalized marketing, you have to sit down and go, well, how can you personalize a cosmetics advert for an extrovert, or for someone open-minded, or for someone agreeable versus low agreeable? And it's not trivial to come up with, what should the marketing message be to those kinds of people? And that's partly why it took us about, 3 or 4 years to run these studies, because coming up with the right creative and the right message isn't something that is sort of as simple as it may seem on the face of it. And that's what I've seen from the Trump stuff as well. So some of their adverts have been leaked, and I've been shown some of them. And it's not clear that they're actually doing a lot of the psychological marketing that they talk about. So it's not clear from the advert that what they're doing is likely to be very effective. So that is, and that's not to say that it won't be possible and that there won't be more of this done in future. I think there almost certainly will be, but I don't think it's something that has had such a huge effect up until this point. So I think people should be vigilant, but also not so afraid that they think, it's already sort of too late.
I think it's a really interesting point you make. And I think also this idea of, often we think of these things as being something which are either deployed with extraordinary precision, with great impact. And we forget that actually these sorts of approaches take time to integrate into industry, whether that's marketing or advertising or content creation or whatever it might be. I'm kind of curious to ask whether you think that there is a medium ground where we can use some of these approaches in an ethical way, where we don't remove people's agency, where we operate with transparency to create a better experience for people. So maybe where we request consent from customers that have expressed an interest in a specific brand, and then over time we develop more tailored content or products that they're going to enjoy better, that they've kind of, where they know what they are giving up and what they're getting in return. Do you think that's something that is potentially on the horizon?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. So this stuff can be used, essentially you've got the ability to persuade someone by sending the right message. Now that can be used to persuade you to do something against your own interest, or it can be used to persuade you to do something that is in your own interest. So if it's persuading you to exercise more or to use fewer addictive substances, then that's a positive use. If it's getting you to do something that a politician wants you to do that isn't actually in your own interest, but it's in the politician's interest, then that's using your data against you. So I think there is a way to use it in a positive way. So let's take the political example. I've sort of thought about, could you use the fact that you can measure someone's personality from their big data? Could you personalize politics in a way that's actually beneficial to them? And the area I thought about was when politicians write these political manifestos. So each year in the UK, not each year, but each election, they come up with a manifesto. They normally make it sort of bright and colourful, and they probably write it in language that they think is fun, but still no one actually reads it. So what about you go to a website, you share your Facebook data or your Twitter data or your email data, whatever it is, and it analyzes that data, and then it says, well, here is your personalized manifesto with the things that we think you're going to be most interested in at the top. So, I'm an academic. You start telling me about education policy, I'm much more interested than if you tell me about, some other policy that I'm not interested in. And that's not to say that you would then hide a politician's policies on, things that you don't predict that they're going to be interested in. They would just be sort of near the bottom, and the stuff that's most likely to be interesting to you is near the top. So, I mean, that's, it's clear that what is being done, so what data is being analyzed. I've sort of opted into making that happen. It's clear that you're analyzing, this data and you're giving me this benefit from it. And that's the other side. So it's benefiting me. It's not just benefiting the politician. So I think if you do sort of, if companies or politicians or organizations think about how can we use data with people sort of in collaboration in ways that are going to benefit them in, as you said, transparent in ways that they've got control over, then it is possible to use data and sort of personalize things that genuinely benefit people as well as benefiting the company or the organization.
I wonder with that though, so I totally hear what you're saying, and I think that if I was interested in a politician, it makes my job much easier as a voter to have a look at the most relevant topics for me. But is there a balance to be struck between personalising things to entice people to engage versus creating content or campaigns that open up people's perspectives to new things that they might find interesting, but based on their previous digital behaviour, they have shown very little interest towards? So this idea of kind of, instead of tightening the noose or creating a smaller filter bubble, actually expanding that. Is there any room for that, do you think? And whose decision is it whether we want to kind of like tighten our filter bubble or expand it?
Yeah, that's very interesting. These sort of the conversations around we seem to be living in this filter bubble. So we're only seeing you search for something, and now everything you see for the next 10 weeks is going to be based on that first search that you see, right? And you never sort of get out of the original bubble that you started in. I am a lot more skeptical about filter bubbles than some other researchers, for the reason that I think any filter bubble that we have now has to be compared to the filter bubbles that actually we had before the internet came along. So, when I think of the perspectives that I can have access to now that sort of get sent to me just because I've got Facebook friends living all over the world, or Facebook friends of different ethnicities and genders and all the rest of it. When I compare that to what used to happen, which was you pick your newspaper in the morning, you tend to read newspaper from the same editor every morning, and the kind of filter that comes through getting your news from one source versus right now getting your news from all over the place, even though there's an algorithm that sort of selects the news that it thinks you'll be most likely interested in. I just think the filter now is less so than the very strong filter that there was in the past. So yeah, I'm not convinced that the algorithmic filter we've got right now is so powerful compared to just what we lived with previously.
I'm curious about that in terms of just mere exposure based on the medium. So for instance, the fact that if you were someone who was more conservative, you'd read one physical paper, and if you're someone who was a bit more left-leaning, you'd read another, but you'd still have to go to the newspaper section and you'd see the headlines across all the different newspapers. And if you were flicking through one specific newspaper, you would have to generally flick through the different sections on the economy, on culture, etc., to get to the bit that you wanted to. So I wonder if it's changed in the sense that we can choose to shut ourselves off from alternative points of view, which we saw happen with Brexit and also in the US elections, where people are actually unfriending those people who might offer them a different perspective. And it seems that there's a greater emotional charge, and that maybe that's the thing that's contributing to people not being willing to entertain alternative perspectives. Is that something that you think is happening, or do you think, again, it's relative to before, it's something which still isn't affecting people in a really adverse way?
I do think there's a difference now, which is the news is more kind of outrageous. So we're looking for this kind of emotional hit that, you can get that partly from this news comes from someone in my camp, but you can also get it partly from just it's the same news I would have got before, but written in a way that seems sort of more extreme and more, trying to rile me up. And I do think there's an effect here with news organizations sort of fighting for attention, that they do start writing more extremist things, whereas perhaps previously you'd have a newspaper with an extremist kind of, rabble-rousing headline, but actually once you get to page 5, then it's all pretty much tame from then on. So I do think that's going on. On the other hand, I still think it's a matter of a degree, and I think I get so many perspectives, from the people I'm following on Twitter. I'm following 300 people or something, and I just wouldn't have talked to 300 people in any possible way if it wasn't for the internet and Twitter and things like that.
Okay, so let's fast forward 5-10 years down the line when people have honed ways in which to track user behavior and predict things that they'll like, how to target adverts to make them more personalizable, etc. Do you think that ethics committees now have a greater responsibility to consider the potential ramifications of academic research on the public when considering whether to allow certain studies to be undertaken? Because in my view, I think that technology is only going to get better at enabling us to deploy the insights that we glean from these sorts of studies.
Yeah, it's a difficult one because I look back on this this study we did with Facebook data and think, would it be better if that study wasn't done, right? Because then it's less likely that these politician marketer would have picked up on it and used it. But I still sort of I think it's better that academics are doing these kinds of studies and making the answers sort of widely known, as wide as possible, so that people know early on what could be done and therefore can kind of look out for it. So when I think of some of the other things that happen, like fake news and Russia involved and things like that, it sort of felt like we didn't hear about those until after the election mostly, and it sort of felt like it came out of the blue. Whereas some of this kind of psychological marketing and things like that, I feel like there was already, at least in some circles, sort of debate and discussion around what's possible and what our privacy settings should be and those kinds of things. So I think it is better that people know about what's possible early on than we sort of pretend like, we're not interested in the answer to this question. And then the risk is that companies sort of do it secretly, and then we don't find out about it until it's already hit us, until it's already happened, until it's too late to do anything about it. So I think there is an important place for academics sort of researching stuff, making it known widely and starting a public debate as early as possible so that we can try to sort of think forwards rather than just let it happen to us.
Yeah, I think that's a really viable perspective. What's your greatest concern for the future with the kinds of potentials that we're seeing now for this kind of research being used in specific ways? Do you have any concerns?
So I'm not worried about large companies because they're always thinking about their reputation, they're thinking about their brand, they're thinking about what will my customers think. It's those people who don't have customers that I'm more concerned about. So either the little startups who sort of try some stuff just because they can, or the other side is governments who are, less democratic, or at least maybe they're democratic, but they're secret about what they do. And then people don't necessarily know what is happening and know what is possible. And that's when it starts getting scary, when they start using our data against us and we've got no way of expressing our disapproval.
Yeah, I'm completely in agreement with you on that point. What would be your greatest hope for the future relative to all this?
So too often right now, companies sit down and think, how can I get the most from this data? Right, but they don't think about where the data comes from. They just think, well, I've passed the privacy, rules, and therefore it's my data now, and I can do with whatever I like. So I think companies sort of, I want them to start working in ways that kind of collaborate with their customers, in ways that genuinely benefit the customers and not just the company. And so, I mean, I do think this is not necessarily a sort of some brave new world that we've never seen before. I think if you think back to, the 1950s, you went to a shop and you knew the shopkeeper, and the shopkeeper knew you and your family and was able to give you a really personal service. But that's obviously very expensive. So now there's a potential, can we do that on a large scale in a cheap way, using algorithms instead, as long as it's for people's benefit.
Okay, so final question. If you could give businesses one action that they could take to create this more kind of equitable relationship with their customers using this kind of technology, what would that be?
I think it would be transparent with every use of data that you do. And if you're afraid to be transparent, it probably means you shouldn't be doing what you're doing. So I think sort of shining a light on how data is being used is going to benefit both people, but also the companies in the long run, so much more, because people right now, they're starting to feel like, well, I mean, they're already feeling like companies are creepy, companies are using data in ways that I don't understand. And if companies were only sort of, incredibly transparent with what they're doing with the data, then people would not start sort of imagining things that they think companies might be doing, but they're not really. So lots of people think that, Google is listening to us via our phones on the microphone. But as far as anyone can tell, there's no evidence that that's actually happening. But people feel like, it feels like it is happening because you don't understand how Google is so good at what it does. So if only Google was more transparent, then people would not start sort of making up imagined scary things that the companies are doing.
Thank you for listening to the Hive podcast with me, Nathalie Nahai. To find out more about today's guest and the topics we explored, you can find resources and links on the show notes page at nathalienahai.com/The Hive podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please do give us a rating on iTunes and join in the conversation with the hashtag Hive podcast. Thanks again for listening, and I look forward to sharing more with you in the next episode.